Okay, welcome to the final rally of Revolution, a Marxist festival of ideas. It's been absolutely brilliant to see so many people here at the festival, and I hope that everyone has found the sessions useful. We have an amazing panel to discuss the left after lockdown, including how we move on to the offensive against this government and what kind of movements and political organization we need to do that. And our panel has a huge amount of experience on that front. My name is Faizi Ismail. I'm a member of Counterfire. I teach at Goldsmiths and I'm on the union executive. We have recently been in dispute with management, industrial action that took the form of a marking boycott for over 4 months. And we won significant concessions from senior managers. They are, however, hell-bent on pushing through restructuring along with redundancies. And so we find ourselves once again preparing a strategy to resist. And more than likely, we will be battling for strike action in the autumn. I just want to say that Mike Davis, unfortunately, couldn't attend the rally for personal reasons. But as I say, we're extremely pleased that in addition to our original speakers, who I will introduce in turn, we also have Yaseen Aslam from the app Drivers and Couriers Union, and Lowkey, who is joining us. But before I introduce them, I just want to encourage everyone to turn your videos on for this final rally. And if you're tweeting, use the hashtag Revolution2021. So each of our speakers will speak for around 7 or 8 minutes, and I will let the speakers know when they have a minute left. So to kick us off, I'm very pleased that Yaseen Aslam could join us. Yaseen is president of the App Drivers and Couriers Union, ADCU, and along with James Farrar, he led the fight against Uber and won. In March 2021, Uber lost a 5-year legal battle and was forced to concede to reality that Uber drivers and are indeed workers and not self-employed, and therefore should be treated as such, and are entitled to minimum wage and holiday pay and all of that. That was a huge battle that Yaseen was at the forefront of. So welcome, Yaseen.
Hi.
Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you for having me. As Faizi mentioned, I'm the elected president for App Drivers and Couriers Union, and I'm also the founder of International Alliance of App-Based Transport Workers. So last year we formed the International Alliance from drivers from 23 different countries. Now, going back, I actually come into this taxi trade back in 2006. So when we talk about this word gig economy and stuff like that, the fact is it was a job. I was a taxi driver or driver back in 2006. When Uber come into the scene in 2012, it was just another taxi company for me, an app company, and I was a driver where I transporting passengers from A to B. Now, just as Faizi mentioned, I was one of the claimants alongside James Farrar, the lead claimant against Uber. This is a case that we filed in 2015 for workers' rights. So the good thing about the UK employment laws is we have 3 separate status where you're self-employed, then you're employee, and then in the middle we have a Limb B worker. And what a Limb B worker means is you're still sort of technically self-employed, but you're entitled to some basic rights. So, for example, you have the right to earn the minimum wage, holiday pay, and the right to not to be discriminated against. So this was what we were fighting for, Limb B workers. Now, when we started this fight in 2015, obviously, we never knew that this going to drag on for 6 years or 7 years. So we went through a different process through various courts. And the good thing is we did win all the way. But you got to look at the main thing here. We've got a big, massive, giant company, that was actually lost billions in the process to fight us, to fight 2 ordinary people. Why? To deny us our right. And at the same time, one of the problem we had is I think it's wrong when I had to go through that whole process for 6 years is the failure by the regulators and the government, because the laws were there from before, but like for us to assert our rights, especially when you get these companies such as Uber come into the market, and exploit people. Why should it be the workers having to do all the heavy lifting and fight it all the way? So even though we won at the Supreme Court, Uber is still failing to adhere to the Supreme Court ruling. And the reason why that ruling is so important, when we look at Uber's model, they heavily rely on BME workers. So these are people that come from, desperate, vulnerable community, deprived communities. So the Supreme Court was very clear with the ruling, and that was we are workers from the time we log on to the time we log off. So what Uber's doing is they're willing to accept the fact that we're workers from the time we are engaged with a passenger. But that leaves the main problem there for us, which means as they oversupply the market, as they get more and more drivers on the platform, we'll have many drivers waiting around empty, not earning any money. So our fight, in a way, we have achieved a lot, but at the same time, we're finding that because there's lack of enforcement, lack of like basically Uber in a nutshell could afford not to obey the law. That's how it's it is. So because they're not obeying the law, we're going to have these problems. Now, last year was a very bad year for us guys in terms of drivers with the COVID situation. And we really saw how important, like, to be to be part of a union, to be, why we need these protections such as worker status and all that stuff, because we see a lot of drivers going out there earning very little money, getting exposed. We had a lot of our members that actually passed away as well because they contracted the virus. And what we saw was everyone was pushing, it just going from one post to another post. So if you went to Transport for London, which is a regulator that regulates us and also Uber, they will push it onto the Department of Health. Department of Health will push it onto Uber. Uber will push it on. So we're just going around in the circle. So now that, and especially with the Tory government, it hasn't been very helpful with these lockdown restriction, etc. Now, so we got like, so we got that kind of stuff where we're fighting for pay and protection before. Then we got the COVID situation where we got a large majority of BME workers that are highly exposed, and the ONS statistics actually showed this, that it's a tax in the private hard drive and the BME community that are affected. And then we're getting lack of protection and support from the regulator and the government on that side. So that was a second angle for us. And the next problem we started seeing most recently is the data side, the way data and transparency and how these algorithms are being managed and programmed into the system. So, for example, we had one members who got deactivated, basically kicked off Uber's platform, fired, and then on top he had his license revoked from Transport for London, meaning he had no source of income just by a touch of a button and by the regulator failing to look into what actually happened. And what happened here was Imran grew a bit, and because he grew a bit, Uber's app failed to recognize him. And when we started looking into this, and this is not unique to Imran, I'm just giving you an example here. So the Uber's app failed to recognize him. So what Uber was claiming is he's actually sharing his app with someone else. So when we started looking at all this stuff and we spoke to Microsoft and all that stuff, we realized that the system they're using, there's a problem with facial recognition. It fails on people of color. Now, the reason why I'm talking about it is quite important because a lot of people don't talk about the harm it's doing to average people. And these are workers that don't really understand the laws and their rights. So we have Imran who got deactivated from the platform, which was him himself actually on the platform trying to log on to work, but the app failed to recognize him. And as a result, Uber then reported him to Transport for London and he then lost his license. So for him now, he has a car rental that he needs to pay for, and he got his day to day like feed his family. So he's in an awkward, very financial hardship situation, and he's trying to justify to his family why he lost his job. And then he needs the money to be able to fight Transport for London to get his license back. Luckily, he's a member of our union, so we fought it all the way for him. We were able to get it overturned. But the point was, this is we're getting so many of people getting deactivated just because they're failing a system, a software. And it's not just them failing, it is having an impact where it's mentally stressing them out, pushing them to, you know, um, severe hardship and all that kind of stuff. So we got that. And then secondly, recently, we also took a case
You have a minute. You have a minute,
Sorry,
Yaseen.
so just quickly, I want to just summarize. So we also took a case in Amsterdam for the data where we had two guys getting deactivated for fraudulent activity. Now, they weren't committing criminal fraud. What they were doing is cancelling jobs. And because they were cancelling jobs, the system sort of rates them as thing. But because I'm running out of time, I don't want to go quickly. But I just want to quickly say today, one of the reasons why I started organising wasn't around the pay. It was about attacks and assault and the racism and discrimination we face within our trade. And today, yes, we got the England football match, and a lot of people won't really talk about it and think about it. So we're going to have plenty of drivers out there today watching the football match when it's quiet. Yep, and then straight after that, that's when the work picks up. And what we find is, especially on a day like today, you get a lot of racism, a lot of abuse. And Uber, like the apps companies like Uber, they share the data with Met Police for surveillance. Yeah, and we have all this surveillance and CCTVs and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it's rigged. It's rigged in a way where drivers will get attacked, but that data won't be used to help them. So let's say if a driver gets attacked today, it's hard to get Uber to cooperate. It's hard to get police to actually take action against someone because it's a driver. So the point is, how do we how do we make sure that drivers are protected? How do we make sure the regulators are doing? And that's more of a fight for us in terms of the union, is making sure that we could build this collective power. And in a very short time, as a union, we become so powerful with members. We've 100% funded ourselves, so we're going the right way. But there's a lot more to do, and there's a lot more to say. But I'm sorry, I just ran out of time. But I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end if needed. Yeah.
That's brilliant, Yaseen. Thank you so much. And it's so good for us to hear that detail, and it's so outrageous, but that needs to get out there. So yeah, that's brilliant, and huge solidarity to you for your organizing. We're next going to hear from Laura Pidcock. We're so pleased that Laura could join us. Laura served as MP for Northwest Durham from 2017 to 2019. And she was Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. She's on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and is also National Secretary of the People's Assembly. Thanks so much, Laura, for being here.
Thank you very, very much, Chair. And how bitterly frustrating is it listening to Yaseen and the struggle that you are going through to try and penetrate such a convoluted set of legislation, which makes it so difficult for workers to actually realise their rights. And we did produce, under Jeremy Corbyn, a wonderful manifesto of work which looked to simplify the definition of worker, so that those huge corporations couldn't get away with such exploitation. But sorry if you can hear my son in the background, by the way, being a dinosaur, but he's obsessed with dinosaurs at the moment, and I don't want to kind of curtail that enthusiasm. But yeah, my name is Laura Pidcock, and I'm National Secretary of the People's Assembly. You've probably spoken a lot this weekend about what we are fighting against, but I just was thinking when I was preparing what to say to you today, like, has there been any other generation with so much access to information about what is happening to all of us collectively within this capitalist system, and to be able to connect to one another and understand the international nature of that crisis, to be able to witness the ravaging of our planet, a consequence, of course, of the excesses of the most unregulated neoliberal nations. We are, of course, facing the most serious set of circumstances, and you've probably spoken about them at length this weekend. The litany of attacks can feel really bewildering, can't they, especially amidst living through this health crisis. There's so much to fight to protect our communities against, and so much to fight for as well. If we just take that one piece of legislation, the Police, Crime, Courts and Sentencing Bill, an attack on the fundamental right to assemble, and of course an attack on Gypsy and Traveller sisters and brothers too. In that piece of legislation, and apologies if you've already spoken about this, but there is a clause which talks about being able to seize the assets of Gypsy and Traveller people, which essentially is those people's homes. It's a fundamental attack on a nomadic way of life. The introduction of voter ID for elections, more bureaucratic restrictions of electing people to Westminster. I'm just going to check in. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, because everybody's frozen on my screen. Everyone's in like a lovely pose, but yeah, and the Tories, of course, have an 80-seat majority, so there will be a continuation of austerity, a predictably nonchalant attitude towards super exploitative practices like Yaseen just outlined, or fire and rehire practices, and mass redundancy. So where do you even start? You know, in the face of all of this and the international context, where do you even start? What is the left response? And I think the shorthand is to get in the mix, to get stuck in. And I think particularly to be building spaces in our community that are hives of activity, that give us the ability to meet and discuss them, to be organised, places of mutual aid, but also immensely political spaces, and spaces where we can also have fun. In my community in County Durham, I don't know what it's like where you are, but the attack on organised labour from Thatcher and beyond took away many of our organising spaces. Lots of the kind of community-owned spaces, of course, have disappeared through austerity and with the closure of such huge industries like the mining industries, like the social clubs, all of the different spaces where working people would have met and organised have disappeared. And I think it's incumbent upon us on the left to put those spaces back. It's very, very clear that the Labour Party is in a different place than it was 2 years ago. And we are also beyond the chasm that was Brexit. And therefore, I think it should be our priority that we are the opposition, street-based movements are the opposition, the left inside and outside of the Labour Party are the opposition to this government, but crucially to reach out beyond those spaces that we usually occupy and confidently present the alternative. It really can feel quite bleak at times. It can feel like the right have a stranglehold on discourse and a dominance over how we even imagine the future. But I do reject that. I reject it for a few reasons. We know that capitalism is the crisis, that working class people, because of this crisis, can see how unequal society is. We know that the system's not built for us and it doesn't exist to serve our interests. And out of this crisis, we must make sure that our present is felt, because I think for many people, and you'll know in your own lives, many of their eyes will have been open to the situation and the nature of capitalism in a very different way than they had before, allowing us to have much more open conversations. The amount of people now interacting with the social security system, and the amount of people now unfortunately facing worklessness is astounding, and that will only deepen as we leave the crisis. So we need to create spaces that allow us to have political conversations. We need to build the broadest and most diverse possible coalition against this government, an anti-capitalist coalition, if you like. That People's Assembly demonstration, thank you very much if you came on it, by the way, just a few weeks ago. It was the first kind of united force in ages. It was diverse, it was young, and you had blocks, Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, United for Black Lives, Kill the Bill Coalition, all of the affiliated trade unions, and we must build on that very broad coalition under a general kind of get the Tories out slogan. Linking the industrial and political is so important. And I suppose this is where I'll end, Chair, is that I do think that what the left, again inside and outside of the Labour Party, must do is be there when organised labour is taken in industrial action, because I think they're immensely political spaces. I think there has been an attempted political sanitisation of the trade union movement over decades after a litany of anti-trade union legislation, and that link up with the political and the industrial is so important. But what is just clear is that we cannot retreat. We must not retreat. There's a new generation of activists who are hungry for a different system, and we must make those people welcome. We must join them in their fight, but most of all, we just must not give up. And on not giving up, between the 3rd and the 6th of October is the Tory Party conference in Manchester, and the People's Assembly will be there protesting against this government. I hope to see you there too. Thank you so much for the invite to speak here.
Thanks so much, Laura. That's brilliant. And thanks for, yeah, that's a reminder to us. We are the opposition inside and outside the Labour Party. It matters what we do. So thank you so much for that. Next, we'll hear from Lucy Nichols. Lucy is a student activist and has been central to a series of campaigns against the University of Manchester over its treatment of students during the pandemic. She was also central to the occupation that finally forced Manchester to provide a rent rebate to students to the tune of £12 million. So we're really lucky to have Lucy here. She has a huge amount of experience. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks for that introduction. That was fantastic. Yeah, hi, I'm Lucy. I'm a member of Counterfire and involved at the University of Manchester, and also involved in the Stop the War Coalition. Today, I think I follow on from Laura's speech quite well, because I'm going to talk about the newest generation of people who have joined the political arena. I think it's a bit cliche to call them the next generation, but the newest generation of people who have joined the political arena is young people. And I think whatever you call young, I think it's clear that protests over the last year and a half have gotten much younger. And that's for a number of reasons, but I think the main reason is the pandemic, which has obviously only exacerbated pre-existing problems in society. And that's relevant to all parts of society, whether that's the NHS, schools, austerity, crime, racism, and so on. Everyone has suffered as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the Conservative government, but perhaps especially young people who've had to give up a year of their lives only really to be scapegoated for this pandemic to some extent. But I think because of this, there's a fantastic level of anger amongst young people at how unfair the world is, and also how unfairly they've been treated in terms of schools, the A-level fiasco, the mental health epidemic, universities, and more recently, injustices that they see around them, like Palestine, like racism, and of course, the overwhelming and horrific disaster that is the climate crisis. I think this is probably enough to bog someone down, to leave someone apathetic or, even worse, alienated. But a spectacular thing has happened in the last year and a half or so, and that is that young people, or people in general, but especially young people, have been marching in their thousands, fairly spontaneously in the most part, but against injustice and racism and inequality. I think it was well over a year ago now that George Floyd was murdered by American police, and I think along with the tragic and avoidable death of Belly Mujinga, this has acted as a catalyst of anger in the UK against racism, along with sort of longer standing issues like Stephen Lawrence and Grenfell. I think the Black Lives Matter protests were huge and massively important in highlighting the very endemic racism of the British state, which is of course, reflected in all levels of British society. And while the level of politics wasn't at times the highest, and maybe a lot of moralistic ideas came into the mainstream, it was fantastic to see so many young people fighting the cause. And it was unfortunately quite difficult for the wider left to intervene in these demonstrations, largely because of COVID and it not really being safe to do stalls and give out leaflets and stuff. But this wave of demonstration was amazing. And I think definitely at the time was the youngest and angriest demonstration I've ever been on. I sort of hark back to the first Black Lives Matter demo when we marched from Hyde Park to Grenfell Tower. And when they tried to kettle us at Grenfell, we marched straight through the lines of police and sat at Grenfell for a good hour. And I think these Black Lives Matter protests definitely paved the way for the Kill the Bull movement, which was, in many cases organised by the same people, and therefore had very similar politics, although the left, I think, found it much easier to intervene in this most recent wave of anger. And once again, I think Kill the Bill represented another huge movement that allowed, even more very young people to join the political fray and understand what they were up against, and that is a Conservative government. We also, of course, saw huge movements take place against the education system, particularly in universities. In January, 56 universities across the country were on rent strike, which is 25,000 students withholding rent from their universities. And we've also seen 7 occupations across the country with varying degrees of success, but there were 2 in Manchester, Sheffield, Warwick, Glasgow, Nottingham, which were, you know, fantastic to see, and another huge wave of young people standing up. But I also think what is particularly interesting is that some of the most successful fightbacks at universities have been where the leading activists, the organising activists, were already involved in the labour movement. Not to blow my own trumpet, but the success of the occupation of Owens Park Tower, and that was a win of £21 million, we've just found out, not 12 million, 21 million, was largely down to the fact that we managed to sort of rally the wider left, the UCU, students and even the media behind us, and also in part due to the People's Assembly for holding a meeting that I think 20,000 people watched on the first night. I think the failures of the other fightbacks have maybe been in not understanding the importance of the labour movement, or perhaps not knowing how to sort of harness this support. And I think maybe going forward, this is something that we as the organised left will hopefully be able to intervene in, and something that I think students going forward will be able to understand the importance of, because we are going to see another wave of rent strikes, and we are going to see another wave of occupations, because the university system hasn't changed at all going into the next year. I think lastly as well, I want to talk about the final example of students and young people really fighting the system, and that is the fantastic and inspirational wave of Palestine protest that we've seen in the last month or so. I think every Palestine demo feels a bit younger than the last, and I feel quite old at most of them, and I'm 21, so I think that says a lot about the demographics at these demos. I think we were all also pretty pleasantly surprised to see, I think, was it 250,000 people on a demo for Palestine, the PSC and Stop the War organised. And this was obviously also very much attended by a very young demographic. And more sort of inspirational is that the Palestine demos that I've been on recently, I can't speak for everyone, but the Palestine demos I've been on recently have had a very high level of politics behind them. And I think people understand Britain's deadly role, young people understand Britain's deadly role in this apartheid without having to stretch very far. And I think they also understand the links between, you know, the arms trade and their universities, the arms trade and their schools, hospitals and so on. You know, and there was a Palestine demo that just on Friday that was small but very good and was supported by, you know, the trade unions. It was supported by the NUS nationally, which I think is a very good sign of things to come, because going forward, hopefully the NUS nationally can continue to support Palestine, perhaps where it hasn't done before. So I'll wrap it up now, if that's all right. I hope everyone can sort of understand, I hope I've made it clear just how involved young people have been, many of them for the first time, in these massive and like hugely important mass mobilisations. And it is spectacular to see, because I've had housemates come on Palestine demos with me where before they wouldn't have understood the importance of actually getting on a demo, and they've enjoyed it and now want to come on more. So I think our challenge now as the left is sort of to engage with, or to continue to engage with, the very young people who are out on these marches, who are, you know, increasingly angry and aren't necessarily sure how to direct their anger. I think we need to keep working like we are now to bring these masses of very angry young people over to our kind of politics. And, you know, I don't mean we want them all to join Counterfire immediately, because, well, you know, that would be great, but it would also be a logistical nightmare. I'm instead talking about building the biggest and broadest movement possible in the form of a united front, you know, in other words, in the form of the People's Assembly. So I think we need to continue along the lines of what the People's Assembly did on the demo a couple of weeks ago, which had, you know, absolutely everyone on it, from Kill the Bill to GRT communities to a huge Palestine contingent. And hopefully in the next few months, as people continue to be angry at the Tory government, which is just getting worse and worse and worse, we can have a left, an extra parliamentary fighting left that's, you know, strong enough to take on the Tory party and win.
Thanks so much, Lucy. It's brilliant to hear all of that, and it's brilliant that student leaders like you are making those connections between student politics and wider politics, and spreading those ideas. So next we're going to hear from Anthony O'Hanlon. Anthony is president of the UCU branch at the University of Liverpool, who are probably in the biggest dispute in higher education today over redundancies. They have taken over 3 weeks of strike action, followed by a marking boycott. And these are redundancies to, of all things during a pandemic, the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences. The UCU has mounted an amazing campaign at a national level, and there is now also an international boycott against the university. So huge solidarity to you, Anthony, and all the trade unionists in this struggle.
Thank you very much, Faizi, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'll be following on from Lucy, and I think it's always hard to follow student organisers because we have so much to learn from them, really. If UCU took some time more often to speak with students and learn how they organise, would be in a much better position. But I think it's also very fitting to continue to talk about the woes of the marketisation of higher education and the impact on both staff and students within this. So, as was outlined, the University of Liverpool decided during the pandemic to make 47 health and life sciences researchers redundant, or to propose compulsory redundancies. There's no financial necessity for these redundancies. The University of Liverpool is a very wealthy institution. Recent turnover is well over £500 million, and their projections for this year, the financial year, look to have a surplus of around £16 million. So there's absolutely no financial need for this whatsoever. What part of the original rationale behind it was that this was designed to help address health inequalities in Liverpool, because well-paid, secure employment isn't a key contributor to a healthy life outcome, obviously. And then within this, staggeringly, the people who are at risk, we have mental health trainers, people who train clinical psychologists on programs when funding for mental health services in the NHS is at an all-time low. We're losing academics within there. There are head and neck cancer experts when Liverpool has 3 times the national rate of head and neck cancer, and rare bone disease, Paget's disease, which is a very rare disease, experts within that. And most staggeringly of all, a member at risk who is looking and has pivoted their research into looking how to develop new treatments for COVID. And the university have celebrated this individual's work at some point also. And I should say the criteria that is being used is very apt when we've had speakers from kind of Uber as well. And you know, we're talking about, you know, tackling financial capitalism and big institutions, because it's the criteria being used is Amazon rank and yank tactics, really, where these people are at risk based on the level of income they generate for the institution, not the quality of their research, not their teaching, nothing to do with that, just how much money they bring in to the organisation in terms of research grants. I mean, you know, how that could be an indicator of anyone's contribution to any organisation, let alone a university, is incredible. So, you know, I think this is kind of important for, I don't think I'm probably telling anybody a surprise who's in this room, but for a lot of people who are unaware that universities are not these wonderfully gilded liberal institutions where everyone has a nice time. They are as ruthless and abhorrent as employers as there are out there. Their treatment of students, from the racial profile of Manchester students to the chasing of rents and, you know, the kind of accumulation of capital through their kind of their shoebox halls of accommodation at the expense of anything else, is a sign of how they operate. But our action so far, as was outlined, has been very strong. Our branch had the biggest ever turnout we've had in an industrial action ballot. Through the course of industrial action, we now are in a position where 47 redundancies have now become 21. We've already saved around 26 jobs, but that obviously isn't enough. We will continue to fight for every last one of these jobs. And I think there are a number of reasons for this, and I think a lot of UCU members across the sector realise that this is a test case, particularly for other universities, to look and see how they could get away with implementing something very similar. Because, you know, the kind of the criteria that's being used, obviously the abhorrent nature of the kind of rank and yank tactics is appalling, but there's also very kind of problematic issues for UCU as a union. You know, we are working a lot of kind of activists within the union are working hard to eradicate casualisation and to fight back against precarious employment, which is far too rife in Liverpool and across other universities. I mean, 37% of academic staff at the University of Liverpool are on a fixed term contract. And this, what they're doing at the minute is, even those who have the, you know, the supposed kind of job security and a permanent contract, these kinds of criteria, if pushed through, make anybody precarious, make anybody at any time liable to be sacked. If you don't meet their various metrics that they dream up, you are at risk next. So, you know, it's very important at the time we are fighting to eradicate casualisation, our employers seeking to entrench it and to further kind of embed it within their operating practices. So, you know, it's a very important strike, and I've just seen a very kind message about making donations to our strike fund. I think that's been very important. You know, as Faizi outlined earlier, market boycotts are a very powerful tool for UCU members and our university in particular. At the time of year this has happened, our employer decided to donate, to deduct 100% of pay for participation in that action. So obviously, you know, kind of we've had to do a big job of fundraising, and we've done a hell of a job of fundraising actually to empower members to continue to participate in this boycott, because at the time of year this is where our key kind of leverage lies. And I should say within this, there's been a lot of media coverage. There are 4 huge departments where no students have any marks, but then University Spin is talking about the majority of students will have marks elsewhere. We should say quite right now, those students who do have marks are often looking at zeros, resits, fail, and the anxiety that can obviously cause for students because, you know, because that work hasn't been accurately marked, it is, you know, is quite kind of high. But the student support has been absolutely phenomenal. There's been grassroots students, not affiliated to any kind of student union politics, who've organised demos on campus. The student union has been fantastic too. You know, again, it's kind of an area where our interests are mutually aligned, and that solidarity can be built, because unsurprisingly, students don't want to see their lecturers be sacked. So, you know, the complete kind of attempts once again for management to play divide and rule has backfired massively. We're looking at one of the biggest ever campaigns now of staff student solidarity, and I think that's really important. And there's lessons to be learned, as I was saying earlier, about how students organise and how UCU and other unions can learn. Really, I think, you know, kind of this is, however this goes, I think our branch and particularly will be wanting to talk, you know, we've always worked with students, but much more about kind of our aims are common. You know, that we always talk about the need to eradicate marketisation, to fight for a free education system, to fight for a kind of carbon neutral university, and how we can do this in a mutually kind of inclusive way is really important, I think, because, you know, it's not a trite cliche to say that students' learning conditions are staff's working conditions. It is a fundamental principle of the university system. So I think that support and solidarity we've received has been a huge boost in this. I've not been well for the past week, so I'm a bit kind of all over the place here, not too sure what I'm saying, but so I'll wrap up soon just because I'm conscious of the time as well. But I just want to kind of say to anybody who has been able to donate to our fund, or knows about the strike, or knows any way they can place pressure on this employer, we are beginning to see further movement. They are now, after 7 weeks of ignoring us, keen to talk to us after realising we can take strong and sustained effective industrial action, that we're not going anywhere until jobs are saved. So we are beginning to see a little bit of movement, but cautious optimism is my tone. I don't think we should be doing cartwheels just yet, because we know how abhorrent our employer is. We know how they will try and stretch things out and continue to take the piss because of the dedication to these vanity projects that higher education rests upon, really. You know, millionaire managers who get by through inflicting misery on staff and students and fail upwards into better jobs, better paid jobs, and you know, kind of peers and everything else that follows that. So I think that there's a long way to go still, and any organisation that sends messages of solidarity, or, you know, can do anything, is always a big boost to our members. Like Faizi said, it's one of the biggest UCU strikes in quite some time, and to not kind of blow smoke up our own arses at a local level, it's probably now the biggest dispute since the Dockers, which is always a kind of a nice thing to say as a Scouser, to know that kind of that's the scale of the action we're in, because of the numbers involved and and the time involved in this. So thanks a lot for allowing me to come and update on this. And you know, here's hoping for a big win for a union that our labour movement desperately needs. Thank you, and solidarity. Thank you so much, Anthony. That's brilliant to hear. And I mean, your struggle is really everyone's struggle. Certainly at Goldsmiths, we have a lot to learn from what you're doing. And you know, it's hugely important also because higher education is at the centre of the ideological attack against the left by the Tories as well. So huge solidarity to you. So next we'll hear from Lowkey. Lowkey is a rapper, political activist, anti-imperialist, and he's been a vocal supporter of Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Stop the War Coalition. He's been outspoken against the government, from British foreign policy to Grenfell, and he endorsed Jeremy Corbyn in the most recent general elections. He's a great ally, and we're so pleased to have you here, Lowkey. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Now, according to Oxford University professor Danny Dorling, prior to the pandemic, we had already lost 130,000 people in this country due to austerity. That was an act of social murder. Today, we stand on a death toll, which is around 130,000 people from COVID alone. That was an act of social murder as well. During this pandemic, you've seen 1,000 billionaires increase their wealth in the world today by 2.7 trillion pounds. You've seen workers in the world lose 2.6 trillion pounds in wages. And today in Britain, we have the most diverse cabinet in British history that has had a policy of quasi-eugenics towards the elderly and disabled in care homes in this country. A cabinet which allows the intelligence services to kill at will without accountability and is on the verge of banning protest outright. It makes sense that in the culture wars, this government is utilizing the symbol of Winston Churchill. Well, let's not forget that Winston Churchill voted 21 times against establishing the NHS. Even after World War II, when 30% of homes were destroyed or damaged, where infant mortality was 10 times what it is now, and when more than 20,000 people died in 1 year alone from tuberculosis. Let's not forget that it was Winston Churchill that put it this way: I propose that 100,000 degenerate Britons should be forcibly sterilized and others put in labor camps to halt the decline of the British race. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw between March and July, disabled people, despite accounting for around 20% of the population having some form of disability, accounting for 60% of all COVID deaths. We saw 1/3 to 40% of those that died being from the care homes, despite the fact that only 0.6% of the population were in care homes. That was about 10% of the population of care homes dying. And in fact, the University of Manchester, in a study released last November, put it this way, that it was likely that the care home death toll was undercut by about 10,000 people. So when you see those coming out and saying the vast majority of those that died from COVID had pre-existing health conditions, this is who they mean. We have to remember that at this early stage of the pandemic, tens of thousands of COVID sufferers were put into care homes from hospitals where there was no PPE. We also know that the government, just before the pandemic took hold, changed the classification of the coronavirus in order to save some time and dodge their obligations regarding PPE. We've also seen it estimated that around 350 non-COVID patients died of thirst in care homes and hospitals during the first lockdown alone. And while the pandemic got into its full swing throughout March, it wasn't until April 15th that care homes were given the ability to demand a test and to reject COVID-19 patients from their care. At that point, you had councils threatening those care homes that they would withdraw their funding if they refused to take in COVID sufferers. We also saw in care homes the administration banning and muzzling employees from speaking out about the lack of PPE. We also saw a frailty index by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, quite an ironic name, to assess the viability for critical care. And you had those defined as moderately frail being those who need help with complex tasks like financial management, transport, or heavy housework. These people, it was suggested by NICE, could have critical care denied because of this way in which they were defined. Thanks to an organized response by disability groups, NICE had to pull back. But however, what you did see was the application of blanket do not resuscitation orders. And in fact, 1 in 10 care homes were told to put these do not resuscitate orders on their residents. And in fact, you see that GPs across the country were informing vulnerable patients that it would be a good idea to fill out these do not resuscitate forms. You even saw 19 hospital patients dying because they had learning disabilities or Down syndrome, and that was given as the reason not to resuscitate them. The direction of this virus was engineered by our government in a very careful way. Whether it was down to incompetence or whether it was cynical, it's not really important because the result was social murder. Now, whether you have been deprived of breath in Grenfell Tower, or you've been deprived of breath because of a government that has directed a virus in your direction, or you are drowning because of Frontex, the bottom line is you can't breathe because the state is depriving you of death and of breath. And we must assert again and again and again that this government is guilty of social murder. And those who stuck to the Keir Starmer line of not wanting to second guess the government at this time are equally as culpable. Now we are in a situation where we have legislation around what migrants are to expect when they try to come to this country, what refugees are to expect when they come to this country. This is preparation for the climate breakdown, which we are only seeing the beginning of. And when you had the largest ever poll on climate change, you found that in the United Kingdom, 81% of people believed it was a global emergency. Now, what kind of situation are we in? After austerity, where 40% cuts in funding to the UK Environment Agency, we've been left with just 0.13% of yearly government spending going towards the UK Environment Agency. And in fact, it only employs around 1,000 people in its frontline staff to regulate supposedly over 1 million businesses. And not only that, since the Deregulation Act of 2015, you have a growth duty instilled within the way in which these regulators have to deal with companies, meaning that they have to consider the impact of the decisions on economic health of business before they are able to actually enforce the law properly. Now, when we look at those who define the cultural ambience of our time, the newspapers, it's been found that only 0.4% of overall coverage on corporate broadcast, morning, nightly, and Sunday news is dedicated to climate change. We also know that after the Black Death, which is believed by some to have wiped out half of Europe's population, you saw a massive increase in anti-Semitism. We also know that the United States was able to get itself out of the Great Depression really by war, by giving people jobs to work, making uniforms, making hardware, and joining the army. Well, the situation we now have is the attempt to turn the coronavirus into a weapon against China. This is...
Wrap up now, Lowkey.
Say that again? Wrap up now?
Wrap up, yeah.
The point is this: we now, in this country, because of Brexit, have our biggest source of goods and supplies coming from China. China is not isolated. It's the largest trading partner with Brazil, with India, with Australia, 3 key allies to the United States. Through the EU 16+1 or the Shanghai 5 or the Belt and Road Initiative, China is far from isolated. In fact, in the G7, 3 of the largest economies, the US, Japan, and China, their biggest trading partner is China. We are not in a position where Britain, as having military bases in 5 countries around China, and the United States having 400 military bases around China, it is conceivable that we could enter war with the country which, according to Goldman Sachs, by 2030 will be the world's #1 economy. This is not a rational policy, and we must organize as widely and as broadly to stop that march to war.
Thank you so much, Lowkey. That's always informative and useful. Thank you. And finally, we'll hear from John Rees. John Rees is a political activist. He currently heads up the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. He's also the author of several books, including Counterfire's book on strategy and tactics, and also A People's History of London, and The Leveller Revolution, published by Verso. And he's also currently working on a second major book on the English Revolution. John.
Thanks very much. I think it's undoubtedly true, as Lowkey has made abundantly clear, that this is one of the most criminal governments that's ever ruled this country, and there's a very significant competition for that title. And I believe that it's the elementary duty, the moral duty really, and I don't often use that kind of language in politics, but I think it's appropriate here. It's a moral duty never to forget and never to forgive what they did to us in the COVID pandemic, and not only in the COVID pandemic. And the question therefore arises, what kind of condition are we in as a left and a working class movement to begin to alter the society so that they can never do that again? Because believe me, whether it's a potential military conflict with China or Russia, whether it's another wave of the pandemic, whether it's another period of austerity, they are all too willing, more willing even than the Thatcher governments, to do that to us again. So I want to use my time to look at us, to look at the brief survey of where we are, what the geography of resistance is in this country at the moment. And I think in many ways, it's probably a more positive picture than you might think. I know that the whole left, whether we were in the Labour Party or not, supported Jeremy Corbyn, that the actions of the Labour Party right in sabotaging that project and the loss of the last general election were serious blows. And I know that many people are still recovering from that, and that it's been a long COVID recovery, I guess, because the ability to organise on the streets was made virtually illegal during COVID. But I think as we come out the other side, and I hope we are, there's a few things happening. The labour market's tightening, and the level of industrial action in this country is on the rise. It isn't a qualitative change yet, but it is a significant quantitative change. We've had disputes here reported and discussed, and the people behind them talk to us today, but there are many of them. I saw an old friend of mine Alan Jones, who's the chief reporter at the Press Association, the other day. And if you don't get our industrial bulletin from Counterfire, you could do worse than also follow his Twitter feed, because he's one of the old style industrial correspondents. And he said he can't remember a time since the 1970s when there's been as many industrial disputes or ballots for industrial disputes or conflicts going on in the workplace. So I think there's the possibility of some significant changes from that direction. I think the ruling class, for all their bravado, are ideologically isolated in this country. The opinion polls showing them ahead in any possible Westminster election, I think, are one indicator, but not the only indicator. You look at the Hartlepool and the Batley and Spen election results, and it's not true that either the government or the very, very loyal opposition are in a good shape when it comes to actual electoral outcomes. And you certainly look at the opinion polls about what people think about the government's handling of the COVID crisis and what they think they should happen next. And it's not a ringing endorsement of Tory policy. And then we come to the protest movement. I think it was a remarkable act that even during the lockdown, the Black Lives Matter movement and the response to the killing of Sarah Everard and then the Kill the Bill protests kept the flame of street protest alive when it was very, very difficult to do so. Very difficult legally, but also very difficult for people to countenance that this was something they should or could do in the middle of a COVID crisis. And then the explosion of anger over Palestine produced some of the biggest, well, the biggest Palestine demonstrations and some of the biggest demonstrations over international affairs at all. And then, as Laura Pidcock quite rightly pointed out, the People's Assembly demonstration, which wasn't the biggest demonstration we've held, I think was nevertheless one of the most important, because it turned out to be a movement of movements. XR were there, Black Lives Matter were there, the Palestinians were there, the trade unions were there, the WASPy women were there, DPAC were there. And I believe if we build on that model for the Tory party conference, we will have done extraordinarily well in emerging from COVID with a vibrant, alive, persistent, determined, angry movement, because I think it's drawing on a sentiment that we saw flash up during COVID. And that was that moment when there was the clap for carers. Now, I know that people say now, and rightly, clapping isn't enough. And I know also that the government tried to take that over, to try and incorporate that. I don't think very successfully. I'm sure you all remember the clap for Boris. No, neither do I, because nearly virtually nobody did it. But the original clap for carers was a grassroots thing, and it's the only thing that was bigger than the Iraq war demonstrations, in millions of homes, in streets that have never seen a protest of any kind, in housing estates around the country. Millions of workers turned out to clap other workers because they thought that the key workers were the moral high ground in this country. And that's an important thing that we can take in, an important impetus into the next period. I want to touch on what the government's doing. There's a lot of talk about them changing track, about the end of neoliberalism, and I'd caution you not to absorb too much of that talk. Of course, there was a certain amount of COVID Keynesianism. Their backs were to the wall and they had to dig into the pockets to save themselves from being swallowed up by a wave of popular anger. But I don't think it's going to last. I think there will be some more state intervention, but state intervention is part of the DNA of modern capitalism. Neoliberalism was never about just the free market. It wasn't a retreat of the state. It was an alteration in the role of the state from being a partial barrier to the free market to being a facilitator of the free market. And any investment that comes now will be the same kind of bankers' Keynesianism that we saw after the crash. It will be money in the pocket of property developers and factory bosses, not in the pocket of ordinary working people who will face another wave of austerity with a government which is viciously authoritarian, which is determined more than any government, including the Thatcher government, to remove the ability to protest at what it's about to do to us. So in short, I don't think they're going to buy us off. I don't think they're going to purchase the red wall. I don't think that's their intention. I do think that they're going to be more repressive, and I do think they're going to confront a movement which is beginning to regain its sense of purpose and confidence, and has so much reason to want to take the battle to this government. So finally, these are the last few words I want to say about what the left should be doing. Actually, I won't talk about the whole left. I'll just talk about what we in Counterfire are trying to do. You see, there's a very broad radicalism. I do believe that. Let me just give you the figures from an Institute of Economic Affairs report that's just come out. Looked into whether or not the much talked about radicalism, Lucy was on about it, among young people is true. And they concluded, yes, it was, because they found out in their polling that 67% of young people say they'd like to live in a socialist economic system. 40% of them said that they agree with the statement that communism could have worked if it had been better executed. And here's the really bad news. It's not just the young. When they looked at what older people thought, they said there is no detectable differences between the economic attitudes of people in their late teens and people in their early 40s. It is no longer true that people grow out of socialist ideas as they get older. Now, if I was the government reading that, I'd begin to get very, very nervous indeed. That is not what the kind of responses that you were getting 10 or 15 years ago. It isn't the kind of responses we got at the height of the opposition to the Iraq war. This is generalized ideological opposition to the system in its entirety by very large chunks of young people, and indeed by wider sections of the population. Our business is to make sure that that radicalization is as deep as it is broad, because I don't think it's actually as deep as, say, it was in the early 70s at the moment. It doesn't have that basis in industrial action. It doesn't have a revived trade union movement yet. Those are things that we have to build. I think we have to resist the idea that identity politics is a sufficient vessel to carry that radicalization. And I'll give you just one example of the failure of that politics. At the peak of the reaction, absolutely justified reaction to the killing of Sarah Everard, there were some people in the, indeed some feminists, who were saying, we can't criticize Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, because she's a woman. Now, I'm sorry, that is a disabling thought. It is a thought which allows somebody who is the head of an institution which has just killed a woman to escape from criticism on the basis of her identity. It isn't identity that matters. It's whether you have power, which class you're defending, who you speak for. That's what matters. And the women who are suffering at the hands of the Metropolitan Police can't rely on women at the head of the Metropolitan Police for any kind of progress. They can turn to trade unionists. They can turn to anti-war campaigners. They can turn to others who share their economic and social location for solidarity. And I think that's one way in which politics, the kind of politics that we've been discussing this weekend, has to be brought into, argued through the strategy and tactics of the movement. There's a big argument at the moment about who to vote for in the Unite elections. It's a very important union election, very important, that the most important union in the country isn't lost to the hard political right of Jess Phillips, Tom Watson, and the Sun. Very important. But that debate would be a better debate if people knew the history of rank and file movements, knew the engineers movement during the Second World War, knew the Clyde Workers' Committee movement, the rank and file movement of the First World War. A theoretically informed, historically literate movement has to be what comes out of this wave of radicalism, and that requires people who publish and argue and hold meetings and educate as well as agitate, and that's what we are committed to doing. I had this conversation with John MacDonald only the other day. He set up this series of history podcasts because he'd spotted exactly the same thing. The movement is broad and radical, but it's not deep enough. It doesn't have a strong enough sense of theory of how capitalism works, of its own history. So that's one thing we're trying to do. But the other thing we're trying to do is to build an activist left. And by that, and I said this at the demonstration in Parliament Square, it's good. Everybody does this. Your first thought is always in politics, how can I argue my corner? You know, my corner is a Marxist corner, a socialist corner, a revolutionary corner. Of course, I want to argue that position. I expect people in the Communist Party to argue that their position, for people who are black nationalists to argue their position, for feminists to argue their position, for people in the Labour Party to argue their position. Of course, that's what a vibrant left should be about. But also, it's important to have a second thought. Not just what do I think, but what is there that I can do in common with people who don't agree with me? Where are the moments of unity? Where are the places that we can get together and act and actually do something? This was always the thought behind the People's Assembly, always the thought behind Stop the War. I might not agree with everybody about their analysis of China, but I want to stop this government going to war with China. And if I don't agree with everybody, that's the basis of a movement, as long as we agree that that's the thing we're going to act on. I might not agree with everybody's economic analysis of why the Tories are doing austerity. Perhaps they'll have a different view than me. But if we're all demonstrating together against the Tories outside their conference in Manchester, that's enough. You know, it was Lenin's view that an ounce of action is worth a ton of theory. Now, we don't need to counterpose the two, but we do need to have a left that looks for where the commonalities are, that argues and discusses its differences for sure, but wants to act together to change things, because that's the only kind of movement that's really going to make a difference for working people. You want to get down to the people in the red wall, you've got to have a movement that makes a difference. They've got to see something that's making a change, not just the talk, not the promises, not once every 5 years in an election, but somebody that's taking the fight to the Tories and trying to beat them. And that requires unity in action. So my organization's committed to this. We want to have a theoretically, politically literate movement, but we want to have a united movement where people with different views get together and take the battle to the enemy.
Thank you so much, John. That's very inspiring. I obviously gave you a lot more time just because I wanted you to say something about Counterfire as well. Thanks, a huge thanks to all our speakers, and thanks to everybody for a fantastic weekend, absolutely fantastic, your participation. Massive thanks to all the speakers in all the sessions and everyone who helped organize the event. We had 20 sessions. They've all been inspiring, full of ideas, and I think help arm us with the arguments for the struggles ahead. And in terms of the struggles ahead, let's make sure that this isn't just a one-off encounter. So as John was saying, please do join Counterfire if you're not already a member. We're always organizing events, so we want to see you at those events. We put out the arguments for a socialist alternative, and we want to continue to organize together in order to mount the biggest offensive against this government that we can, and against the status quo.